is the Banner Baseball Show. Paul Mancano, joined by MASN Orioles insider Steve Melewski. Steve, this is a bit of a throwback. Reminds me of our old hot stove shows, down our trips down to Bowie and Aberdeen when we'd be talking about prospects on the farm for years.
It's not the first time you and I have talked about the Orioles on a broadcast, so we got that going for us.
Yeah. It's just night and day from where it was. I remember, especially in the early days of the Orioles rebuild, we'd be going down to the minor league teams, and I'll never forget your most prescient prediction, which you've made a lot of over the years when looking at a lot of these prospects. But 2019 down in Bowie, Eastern League Championship, you saying, Orioles fans, don't forget about Cedric Mullins. He may be demoted twice this year, but he's going to come back up and he's going to make an impact on the big league team. And 2 years later, he has a 30-30 season. So you've been making these kind of predictions for years. You've had eyes on the farm throughout this entire rebuild.
Well, it's been fun. The Orioles made needed changes. You know, for years they were doing a lot of things right on the farm. It wasn't like it is currently, but it wasn't bad.
Yeah.
And if you look at the homegrown players they had from 2012 through 2016, when they won, 5 years more games than any team in the American League, there were a lot of homegrown players who contributed to that or were part of trades that contributed to that. So that was important. But now it's humming like never before. We've never seen an Oriole farm like this. We've never seen an Oriole farm get to number one in prospect rankings, have this many stud prospects, and they keep, pumping them out. And Mike Elias was true to his word. The first day of his hire, he said, we want to do this right the first time. We want to rebuild it just once, and we want to sustain success. So they reached success. So now they're in the sustaining success portion of the program. And so that's a challenge different than building a winner, right? I mean, it's one thing to get to 100 wins. It's another to stay at or near that level, do something like was done in Houston, which he had a part of that. So, I mean, the Orioles brought in the right people. That's one thing John Angelos did, was a great decision he made, probably the best decision he ever made, to hire Mike Elias, who then made a lot of great decisions underneath him in terms of the front office. And we're enjoying all of that right now.
Yeah, when Mike Elias in his introductory press conference talked about a talent pipeline, it's clear now he really meant we're going to start this pipeline flowing and it's not going to stop. This is not just going to be one giant influx of talent, then we're not going to worry about it. This is going to be sustained over years and years. And now we're definitely seeing the fruits of that. We're going to touch on it later in the show, some of the Orioles' top prospects, Jackson Holliday, Coby Mayo, whether they could be on their way back to Baltimore. But first, Steve, we saw the Orioles take 2 of 3 from the Rangers, kind of dispelling the demons of last year's playoff loss in Game 3 of the ALDS. And as bad as the Orioles had looked in that last homestand right before the break, that's how good they looked in that 3-game series against the Rangers. Obviously, they dropped the series finale, but the first 2 games coming out of the gates, and the offense looked like it picked up right where it was before that final homestand of the first half.
It did. And, that homestand, Paul, was the first time all year I thought the Orioles looked not like themselves. They just played less than we're used to seeing. They made fundamental mistakes. They were throwing the wrong bases. There were errors. They didn't hit. I mean, there was just a lot went wrong in that homestand. And finally, they had this miracle win against the Yankees that ended it. And it seemed to that and the rest that most of the team got seemed to get them really going in Texas. So it's a great start to the second half. They looked like themselves again, as they had for most of the year. The Orioles were used to seeing. So hopefully this spurs them to more wins and just keep it rolling now. A lot of questions will be answered in the next 10 days. What's going to happen with any deals? Will there be some moves? Who's going, who's coming, and how they're going to try to fortify this team for the stretch run.
Yeah, a lot could be decided over these next 10 days. Right before the break, we saw the Orioles sneak out that win against the Yankees, and then later that night, add to that talent pipeline that we talked about, drafting UNC outfielder Vance Honeycutt with the 22nd overall pick. Tremendous power, tremendous speed. Some scouts say he's got Gold Glove potential in center field. Steve, as somebody who has followed the draft for years and was particularly in tune with this year's Orioles draft class, Were you surprised at all that Vance Honeycutt, who is one of the top players in all of college baseball, was there for the Orioles at the 22nd overall pick?
Well, they were surprised, more importantly, because I don't have a draft board like the Orioles do, and I certainly wouldn't have one of the quality that the Orioles do. So they were surprised he got to 22, and they were happily surprised. And it occurs to me, Paul, that this is kind of a reverse situation. The Orioles take good college hitters over the years and make them better, add to their pop, add to their slug. Now they've got a guy who already has the pop and the slug, and they need to help add to his contact rate. So this is kind of a different scenario than we've seen in a lot of their top draft pick hitters over the years. And so I won't say they don't care about strikeouts. They do. And their big league team has cut down on them. But sometimes even when the minor league guys, we see the strikeout rate go up a bit, but so does their production. So they really want production. This guy has that. And I think to sustain it, as he moves up the ladder, they're going to need to cut down on the strikeouts. That's the obvious thing. Matt Blood acknowledged that when they took him. So it's a different kind of development task for the Oriole hitting coaches on the farm.
Yeah, you saw last year taking Enrique Bradfield Jr. in the first round with that 17th overall pick. He had the elite speed, elite defense. It was the hit tool and the power tool that were a little bit lacking, but that was something that we heard Mike Elias and Matt Blood say, we can work on that. That's something we can develop. He already has great plate discipline. You know, he is going to be able to draw a lot of walks and he's not going to strike out a whole lot. And this is in Vance Honeycutt, a very different style of prospect. But I think the Orioles are eager to, try to solve this and to be challenged by the idea of taking this great raw hitter with great defense in center field and saying, how can we make his swing decisions better? How can we teach him strike zone discipline? Because that's something that is almost to a man Orioles prospects have had in spades. They have great strikeout rates, great low strikeout rates, and they do have great walk rates as well.
And, this guy's just, as Sig Mejdal has called him, a tool shed. He's got tools on top of tools. And so that's great to get at 22. I've always felt if you have a high pick, and to me, 22 is still a high draft pick when you talk about 600 players who are getting drafted or whatever that final number adds up to be. You'd like to see a player who's really well-rounded, can play offense and defense, can run a little bit, can hit a little pop, and this guy has that. So the Orioles just have to do some fine-tuning here. And as I said, it'll be a different development thing than they're used to because he's got a lot what they like already. And so, I don't know how his strikeouts came. Did he chase a lot? Did they need to hone in on the plate discipline? Were there certain pitches or certain zones? That's what their scouts, the Orioles already know this. They already know where the fix is. Now they have to see, can they do it? And how coachable Vance Honeycutt will be. I'm sure he will be. And so it looked like a great match for a team that's very good with college hitters and a college hitter who's very good. You put these two together, you might be able to get something special.
Yeah, and we know the Orioles under Mike Elias like to go position player heavy early. Then they go with that big run on pitchers, and that's what we saw during the draft last week. We saw position players, 6 of the Orioles' first 7 picks. Then they go pitcher with 10 of the final 14 picks. It's their MO. It's if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the Orioles have great record under Mike Elias of taking these position players and getting the most out of them. Now comes the difficult part of signing all these guys, fitting all these guys into the $10 million, the $10,920,000 that the Orioles have to sign all these guys. And Steve, we saw early in the rebuild, the Orioles really prioritized signing as many guys as they could. 2021, they signed all 21 draftees that year, because they wanted to bring as much talent as possible into the system. But then since then, they've had a couple, later picks that they've splurged on, that they've used more of their draft pool to sign. And that's meant that they have let some guys go unsigned. We saw Nolan McLean wasn't signed, the 3rd-round pick, 2-way player in 2022. That might have been a medical thing. Jim Callis of MLB Pipeline reporting that. They also signed Carter Young, who is a Vanderbilt shortstop. with a way over slot deal in the 17th round that year. So that may have impacted their pool and how much they were able to spend on other guys. So far with this draft class, we saw Griff O'Farrell and Ethan Anderson have already been signed. They signed their 9th round selection. Still have yet to sign Vance Honeycutt. They have until August 1st at 5 o'clock to sign these guys. But do you expect the Orioles to go out and try to sign everybody, or maybe prioritize some of the later high school guys that they signed, and that means maybe they won't be able to sign every member of this draft class?
Well, they took, I believe, 4 high school players, and the last 2 years they took 2 each. So the area scouts are allowed to do a little reconnaissance, about money leading up to the draft, and can get a little bit of the lay of the land, what this player may take. So they're not just doing it blind and picking a guy going, geez, I hope he'll take the slot amount. They have some knowledge before, and so how to make the money work. And as you know, Paul, and some fans may not know, you have that $10.9 million to maneuver for all these picks. Some you can sign a guy for more, but you have to take it from someone else who signs for less. So they've already signed a couple under slots, saving a couple $100,000, I think. And sometimes in picks 8, 9, 10, there might be seniors who take considerably less. You save a little there. And maybe that high school player they took in the 6th round, DJ Layton, will take more than his slot to avoid his college commitment and go pro. So a lot of maneuvering is going to go on here with the dollars to make it work. They'll sign the majority of the picks. They always do. All of them, that's a question. Sometimes you do miss on a couple along the way. And sometimes maybe you took late flyers on guys in the late rounds that you think are going to be hard to sign, but you're just like, well, let's just see how it plays out. And if we miss, we miss, and we get these other guys. So a lot still to happen. But one thing MLB did is they moved that signing date up, which is good, August 1st. So you don't carry this through the whole summer. Couple weeks, you get it worked out, and on you go.
Yeah, I remember from years ago, before they moved that deadline up, talking about it for months on end. When is this going to happen? And the signings would come in drips and drabs over the course of the summer, and it was just very difficult to keep track of. But now at least we'll have a resolution right around the trade deadline, essentially. Let's talk about some of the prospects that the Orioles have currently in their system, already signed and close to the big leagues. Couple down in AAA Norfolk who are getting plenty of attention: Jackson Holliday and Coby Mayo, the 2 infielders that Mike Elias has said recently he expects to be up in the big leagues and impacting this big league team over the second half of the season. We've already seen a small stint from Jackson Holliday. The Orioles send him back down to AAA to work on some things. He seems to have figured some stuff out. Over the last 5 games, he's hitting .471. He was DHing for a while as he had the elbow issue, but he's back in there at second base the last couple of games. The numbers were there for Jackson Holliday in AAA before he got the call the first time. They're there again this time. What do you think the Orioles are looking for the call up this time from Jackson Holliday? What needs to be different for them to say this guy is ready for a second big league stint?
I think they just need to see some continued hitting success, which he will produce, and he might be in the midst of doing it right now. And so for me, Paul, I did not get down one iota on Jackson Holliday. Some people did. Some outlets dropped him out of first in the prospect rankings. That doesn't matter in the long run, because what he's going to do doesn't matter what number's next to his name, right? A year or two down the road. And so Jim Callis, who I respect about as much as anybody in prospects, said he's the same guy to me. And that's what I see too. So I always like it when my opinion concurs with Jim, because he's right a lot. And so I just see this kid still being special, still having maturity beyond his years. He's not going to hit with pop like Gunnar, but he might be Gunnar light, in terms of some of the stat sheet. He runs well. He defends well. I mean, Gunnar will keep short, I guess, but Jackson could play it if they needed it. He's really a good shortstop. I just think it's all there. He's 20 years old. He got a little overwhelmed. I think the difference between the computer strike zone and the human strike zone threw him off early. He seemed to be 0-2 every at-bat in the major leagues, and it snowballed on him. And that's not the first prospect that happened to. So he'll be back. Cal Ripken had poor start to his career. It worked out in the end for him. And there's a long list of really, really good players who did not initially hit. Adley Rutschman went 20 games without an RBI. Fans forget that now. Gunnar was batting 150 last May. So people forget that. This happens. It's more unusual for a prospect to come up in a straight line. They just take off and never look back. That can happen too, but it doesn't happen a lot. So long-winded answer to say, I'm still a Jackson Holliday fan, and I think he's going to be contributing to the Orioles in the second half and be on a playoff roster in October.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And it sounds like the Orioles agree as well. I've seen a lot of, obviously you see a ton of stuff thrown at the wall during trade talk season as we get close to the trade deadline, but you see some stuff on Twitter about would the Orioles be willing to part with Jackson Holliday. You wrote on MASNsports.com recently that this guy is as untouchable as he's ever been. And just because he had some struggles in the big leagues for a small stint, in your mind, I mean, the Orioles shouldn't be moving on from him because of that. They shouldn't have had their opinions change because of that. And it doesn't sound like, from everything we've heard, that the Orioles have in any way soured on his potential.
I don't think so. They've got big decisions to make here, Paul, in these next 10 days. If they want to get one of the best pitchers available and an October difference maker, it's going to take one of their best prospects. And so when people would say to me, well, which one do you trade? Do you see a weakness in any of these guys? I really don't. It's not like I say, oh, well, you watch in 2 years, prospect X, this will happen to him, and the Orioles know it, so they'll trade him. There isn't that. These are premium prospects who the Orioles think are going to be good major leaguers, and the industry does too. So it will hurt to get a key pitcher if it comes to that, because you're not going to be able to do that with prospects 10, 15, 20. It'll take much higher than that, the cream of the crop. So that's a big decision to make. All these kids can really play. And so, like we heard last year, and I think it turned out to be right. Rare, sometimes you hear rumors and some are right, some are wrong. They don't want to part with Westberg. Last year at the deadline, we were hearing that, and it's probably turned out to be true. And they were probably right to make that call, even though it seemed like, are they ever going to call this kid up? It took forever, but look what he's done when he got here. So I think they know some of these kids are really going to be good major leaguers, and if they give up any one of them, they could go on to be a star for somebody else.
Yeah, there's a reason that they're so hesitant to trade these guys. They're not looking to swindle another team and give them a prospect that won't pan out. We've seen what Joey Ortiz did. That we know Mike Elias, that hurt Mike Elias to send out one of his former fourth-round picks, somebody that he had a hand in developing. And he knew at the time he was going to be giving up a player of value, but he just thought Corbin Burns is worth that risk. Even Darrell Hernandez, who was traded in the Cole Irvin trade, he made it up to the big leagues at 22 years old. Elias knows that these guys are good, and other teams know that they're good as well. It's just a matter of, is this worth the risk of getting a player who's going to help us in the short term over the long-term benefit of having a young guy that you've developed come up? Another guy that I think the Orioles would be very, very reticent to trade, maybe not quite as untouchable as Jackson Holliday, but Coby Mayo, 22 years old. He's hitting .297 with a .967 OPS and 19 homers in 68 AAA games. He breaks his ribs early in the season, comes back, picks up right back where he left off. It's hard to find a spot for him currently at the big league level unless somebody is to go down with injuries, but it's pretty clear that the Orioles want to make room for him because they think this kid is just that special.
Yeah, they do. And how do you make room? I mean, they have Ramon Arias and Mateo, who have done a good job for them, and they really like him, and they're liked in the clubhouse, and we get all that. But at some point, do you think you bring up this kid and you're going to improve your team? And I think if Mayo gets here, and I think he will, he's coming to play. I don't think he's coming for that twice-a-week treatment. I think they're going to insert him in the lineup and let him go and hope he takes off. And the defense is getting a little better. We're hearing, I think he might have made an error yesterday or over the weekend that hurt the Tides, but That's going to be a big element here is defense, right? Because it's become a big element of Oriole baseball. They're a good defensive team. They're good throughout the diamond defensively. They don't have a lot of weaknesses there, and they're trying to keep that from being true.
Right. And if you bring these guys up now, I think the thinking is, if you bring them up now as opposed to waiting until, the rosters expand on September 1st or whenever it is, you give them a little bit of time to work through the struggles that they're sure to go through. Maybe they come up and they have the same kind of struggles that, Jackson Holliday had in his first stint or Adley Rutschman had in his first 6 weeks. But then maybe by the time you get into September baseball or get into the playoffs, they've figured some stuff out and they're able to contribute for this team. It's just a matter of finding room for them. And maybe it means, somebody like Ramon Arias or Jorge Mateo is included in a deal for a pitcher, is just somebody who has to be sent there because these are valuable players. Mateo and Arias are veterans. And I know everybody looks at the minor league system. They look at the Orioles' top prospects and they get a gleam in their eyes thinking about these guys. But the Orioles aren't just going to give away Jorge Mateo or Ramon Arias for anything. They're not just going to send these guys out just to make room for top prospects. We were talking in the clubhouse earlier in the season about how these are now prospects blocking prospects. This is a scenario that the Orioles haven't had. If, we go back in 5 years in 2019 and there was a guy like Kyle Stowers waiting in the wings or Coby Mayo or Jackson Holliday, those guys would be up here already. They'd be playing every single day. But the Orioles are just too good right now at the big league level to give them playing time.
Longtime Oriole fans, Paul, will go back to the late 60s, early 70s. There were two players I'm thinking about here who couldn't make it to the Oriole roster. And when they did, they were really good players. Bobby Grich was one and Don Baylor was another. They had to go back to Rochester after they had put up like ridiculous Coby Mayo-like stats. Then they went back the next year because there wasn't an opening. The Orioles of that 69-71, 3 straight World Series, they were a 100-win team. They were so good. Similar situation, but that's how far back you have to go to anything like we have today when they had young talent that on most teams would have been right up there starting, couldn't even make the roster.
Yeah, it is a ridiculous glut of talent that the Orioles have. And I'm sure some of it will be loosened in about a week's time when we get close to the trade deadline. But for right now, the Orioles are sitting there with a winning baseball team. They're sitting there with an incredibly talented AAA Norfolk roster as well. And they have some big time decisions to make. Steve, I can't thank you enough for joining me. At MASN Steve on Twitter is his Twitter handle. And of course, MASNsports.com. You can catch him on MASN, on pregame show. He is your guy to go to when it comes to the Baltimore Orioles. Steve, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time.
You got it, Paul. Enjoyed it.
And that just about does it for the Banner Baseball Show today. Give us a like, a thumbs up, a rate, review, subscribe. Subscribe to the Baltimore Banner as well. $1 for 6 months is how you can get in there. For Steve Melewski, I'm Paul Mancano. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be back in a few days to break down some